what inspired the post-conference in the first place. And the underlying idea has been to address the significant change in public and policy discussions around digital platforms that I think we saw occur over the course of the 2010s. So if we think about that period, it started with social media being heralded as bringing forth a new era of openness and collaboration, but ended with scandals such as Cambridge Analytica, concerns about disinformation and fake news, and the so-called techlash against the perceived monopoly power of the largest digital platforms. Associated with all this has been the large and, I would dare say, post-COVID-19 rapidly accelerating shift in media consumption towards content delivered through digital platforms and what that's meant for traditional media industries and professions. Associated with these changes have been a series of public inquiries, the ACCC in Australia and various others. Manuel Pulpus and Dwayne Winsec have noted that there are at least 50 such inquiries taking place around the world. And I think this also marks a new period of nation states becoming increasingly assertive around their powers related to digital platforms. Trying to guess where we're going in terms of COVID-19. Obviously, it will be a long time before we know the full implications. One's reminded of the question asked of Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai of what he thought the impact of the French Revolution had been, and he said it's too early to tell yet. But a couple of observations. One is that increasingly the public utility dimension of digital platforms is coming through, which could strengthen the case of those such as Senator Elizabeth Warren, who's argued that if digital platforms are public utilities, they require strong public interest regulations. It could, by contrast, point in the direction of what Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella said in the Financial Times over the weekend, that the pandemic means that, and I quote Nadella here, the challenges we face demand an unprecedented alliance between business and government. There's also the issue of, if we thought that there is greater regulation required of digital platforms, what would it involve and who would do it? What are the scope and limits of self-regulation? What are the implications of platform brokered arrangements such as the proposed Facebook Oversight Board? What's the balance between national and international law here? What's the ongoing status of platforms in terms of publishing? And also, I guess, possibly beyond the scope of this presentation, but the implications of what's been termed a new Cold War between the US and China and what that means around different and partially competing, but also partly interconnected digital ecosystems. So with the format of the presentations, we'll go in the order in which they're listed, and I'm just going to that now. Sorry, just slight delay there. So that means we will go first of all with Stuart Cunningham, second with Rosalie Gillett, and third with Lelia Green, and these will be presentations of 15 minutes in length. So Stuart, over to you first. I think you have mute on. Stuart, I think you have the mute button on.
I'm just unmuting, and now I'm selecting the slides. Can you see the slides? Can you see the slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Well, my papers on regulation and governance across the platform portal divide. And there's a rapidly growing set of concerns worldwide about the impact of content aggregation and distribution through digital platforms on traditional media industries and society in general. These have given rise to policy and regulatory debates and development across social issues such as privacy moderation, cyberbullying, public interest infosphere issues such as fake news, the democratic deficit and the crisis in journalism, and competition issues based particularly on Google and Facebook's dominance in advertising markets. Cultural issues such as the impact of streaming services such as Netflix, Amazon Prime and Disney Plus, which Amanda Lotz calls portals, on the ability of content regulation to support and profile country and region specific talent and production capacity, are often bracketed out of these debates. Now, when I first began to think of this paper, I thought that an argument for the importance of framing regulation and governance across this divide was necessary, given the tendency on the part of specialists in one or more of media industry studies, social media studies, law, especially competition law, journalism and cultural and communications policy, the tendency of specialists in these areas to focus too narrowly on what are regulatory challenges impacting on all of these fields. Now, I think that policy actors have done sufficient work that this should now be a fairly obvious point to make. So I'm proposing 3 common threads across the platform portal divide that may contribute to a greater sense of underlying coherence in formulating responses. And these three threads are firstly global and digital players that are beyond the reach of established broadcasting regulation. One of the common threads across several Western democratic jurisdictions from the 1990s is to have excluded early stage digital technologies and services from regulation based on the, at the time, obvious differences between broadcasting and the desire not to impede their prospects of innovation. Now, political economist Dwayne Winsett calls this the neoliberal era of light touch regulation. Although from close observation and to some extent participation in the 1990s policy developments in Australia, I would defend the appropriateness of not regulating such fledgling enterprises as data casting and the very early pay TV years. So that's a debate that we might have. But 20 years later, it's equally obvious that Google, Facebook, and Netflix have sufficient impact on major broadcasting and infosphere markets globally that the capacity of first digital and more recently global actors to remain exempt from national legislative and regulatory frameworks pose critical multi-jurisdictional challenges for governments and regulators. Adding to the complexity of strategies for changing this is that most of the targets are foreign actors and thus may come under such multilateral and bilateral trade agreements as the Australian-US Free Trade Agreement with its grandfathered broadcasting content regulation and its rules which may make content regulation on new services hard to achieve, and also the provenance of the cultural exemption in the new USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement. The second common theme is what I call the black box. What unites a set of concerns about Google, YouTube, Facebook, and Netflix is the very high degree of information asymmetry such Silicon Valley entities insist on in their business operations. This has implications for lack of partner knowledge about the efficacy of algorithmic advertising in advertising markets dominated by Google and Facebook, and the degree to which it can be managed to advantage platforms and related products and services rather than third parties and partners. This has led the ACCC in Australia, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission in Australia, to recommend a new market regulator with the power to investigate and demand information on algorithmic control over news. The prospects for fair deal making and reasonably transparent terms of trade between major global commissioners and licensors of professional entertainment content, such as Netflix, Amazon Prime, and Disney Plus, and national production interests is also very much a case in point under this common theme. The third common theme is aggregators versus contributors. Platforms and portals are more than aggregators of content. They do not originate, but they are less than adequate contributors to sustainable local and national news content, locally derived entertainment programming in national jurisdictions, and native to online talent development on dominant platforms like YouTube. There needs to be greater balance between the profiting from news and entertainment on the one hand, and contributing to its sustainability on the other. Platforms and portals have histories of funding ad hoc initiatives, such as news and journalism, including education, commissioning local product, creative development programs. There are a variety of these around the world, especially when under public and state pressure. While pressure is being brought to bear on platforms, from the social license to operate more generally through to regulation and legislation, governments can act to ameliorate and support. So, for example, in the UK, Cairncross recommended a new innovation fund, working closely with Google and Facebook on sustainable business approaches, and 2 forms of tax relief. And in Australia, the ACCC recommended news subscriptions to be tax deductible for all consumers, and investment in journalism to attract tax offsets. This suite of public subsidies and public-private partnerships around public interest infosphere issues is entirely of a piece with state action on cultural grounds to support national content and talent on portals. So those are three common themes, I think, that bring the portal platform divide together in terms of government, the possibilities of government regulation and governance. So overall then, digital platform regulation debate needs to take greater account of the fact that the social, competition, public interest and cultural rationales for regulation, those four key rationales that I started with, have been applied to both portals and platforms in the European Union and in major countries of the European Union, in particular Germany and France. In China, we see that the blurred distinctions between portals and platforms mean that it is moot to even differentiate them. And virtually universally, around issues to do with children, there is a distinct preparedness on the part of regulators to act across the platform portal divide with relation to, as I say, to children. Now, drawing this towards a close, I want to look at a little more depth at 2 jurisdictions, that is Canada and Australia. So firstly, Canada. In Canada, a root and branch holistic review of the broadcasting and telecommunications legislative frameworks has in January this year brought down its final report addressing reform principles very much applicable across the platform portal divide. This report has the virtue for my purposes of having had to build from first principles the rationale for broadcasting and telecommunications reform. It proposes to radically cut through decades of policy distinctions and exclusions in asserting that, and I'm drawing on this quote from page 11, this new model would bring all those providing media content services to Canadians, whether online or through conventional means, whether foreign or domestic, whether or not they have a place of business in Canada within the scope of the Broadcasting Act and under the jurisdiction of the Canadian CRTC, Radio and Telecommunications Commission, Canadian Radio and Telecommunications Commission. While maintaining flexibility as to the level of contribution, it includes every entity in an omnibus undertaking, and this is also on screen. We recommend that all media content undertakings that benefit from the Canadian media communications sector contribute to it in an equitable manner. Undertakings that carry out like activities should have like obligations, regardless of where they are located. And this goes so far as to include, and this has never been, to my knowledge, in all these developments around the world, it has not been as explicitly laid out as this Canadian review lays out. And that is that it includes both curatorial undertakings, which would include Amazon Prime, Netflix, Spotify, as well as the Canadian portals, the several Canadian portals. It includes aggregation activities, which would be the cable companies. It would include Google News, Apple News, MSN News, etc. And it also includes, and this is the difference with most other developments, it includes sharing undertakings, which obviously mostly go to the question of YouTube and Facebook. And so the question of what has typically been called user-generated content, and what my co-author David Craig and I have called social media entertainment, this category of content is explicitly ruled out in Australian developments in this area, but is included in Canada, and that's worth maybe some discussion as well. Secondly, in Australia, it's less dramatic than these root and branch reform proposals tabled recently in Canada, but it's still complex. And some of this complexity of the platform portal regulatory challenge is seen when we consider that the ACCC Digital Platforms Inquiry, which is a 600-page plus report setting an international gold standard of what assertive national jurisdictions, I'll just change that slide to be relevant to these comments. What assertive national jurisdictions could or should do when faced with the major social, competition, and public interest issues, which particularly Google and Facebook pose for society and the traditional media. There's nothing explicit in the report on portals, and only 3 mentions of Netflix, none of them in any way substantive. But it has been used not only to move to threaten mandated terms of trade between news media and Google and Facebook, but it has also been used as a trigger for ramping up the significance of the cultural issue of sustainability of Australian and children's content on screen media, using the report's recommendation for a quote unquote harmonised framework for media reform. Even though, and this is worth thinking about, even though this recommendation 6 of the ACCC's report, contains nothing directly to do with subscription video on demand or streaming services. This would suggest that the government's strategy is to transfer the high level of now near global advocacy for reining in the influence of the 2 major platforms in the social, competition and public interest fields, and apply it to the cultural field to regulate SVOD or streaming services. On the other hand, the opposite, I think, is just as likely. The Minister, Minister Fletcher, rails that quote, regulated free-to-air broadcasters are competing with unregulated digital platforms and video streaming services. It has been evident for some time, and the COVID-19 crisis has made it even more obvious, that this is not sustainable. These arrangements threaten, the Minister goes on, these arrangements threaten the sustainability of television broadcasters and in turn, the sustainability of the film and television content production sector. So the language of government threatens unregulated digital platforms and video streaming services, but all the actions so far by this government have been to deregulate and subsidise commercial broadcasters, now faced as they are with a major acceleration of their loss of advertising base and eyeballs to the streamers. The test will be whether anything on the side of regulating How are we going for time, Terry?
It is time. You didn't. If you heard some bells, that was the time
Okay,
signal.
I'll give one final couple of sentences. The test then will be whether anything on the side of regulating unregulated digital platforms and video streaming services will arise from the options paper called Supporting Australian Stories on Our Screens, apart from more help to commercial broadcasters. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Big clap there on the screen. Now, Stuart, if you get out of your presentation, second presentation will be Rosalie Gillett, and this is a co-authored paper with Nick Suzor. Is that correct?
That's right. Now, I'll just get my screen up. Okay. Okay, yep. So as you said, Terry, this is a co-authored research project that I'm working on with Professor Nick Suzor, who's also at QUT. It's called Banning Incels, Investigating Reddit's Self-Regulatory Decisions. And as you can see from the big notice here, it is a work in progress. Okay, so incels and other hateful communities have received lots of growing attention in recent years. And so incels is a term that's short for involuntary celibates. And that's an internet subculture that ascribes to deep misogynistic beliefs. So incels argue that society is fundamentally ranked along sex and attractiveness lines, which favour women and typically exclude men from romantic or sexual relationships. Incels have committed numerous acts of serious violence that have received global attention. So in 2018, for instance, Alec Manassian drove a van into a crowd of people in Toronto, and that actually, he killed 10 people and injured 14 others. So incels and other hateful communities have used Reddit to interact with one another. And given that digital platforms significantly increase the visibility of content, there's a real risk that major platforms can legitimize hateful messages and physical violence. So Reddit has been under a lot of pressure to do more to clean up its subreddits over the last decade. But the platform is also deeply committed to freedom of speech and the principle that the power to create and enforce rules is best exercised by moderators of individual subreddits, each with their own cultures and norms. So in 2017, Reddit actually began taking steps to remove incels from the service. So the first major community was called Incels, and that was banned in November 2017. In September 2018, the remaining major incel community, which was called Brain Cells, was quarantined. And that's a decision which aims to prevent content from being accidentally viewed by those who do not actually wish to do so. And that community was then banned the following year in September 2019. So in this project, we're trying to understand how self-regulation actually works in practice. So we want to know what sort of pressure from internal users and from external stakeholders is required before Reddit actually takes steps to remove these toxic communities. So in what sorts of circumstances should we expect self-regulation to work, and when won't it be enough? So one source of pressure on Reddit comes from its own user base. In the past, some of Reddit's users have tried to shift the way that the platform operates. So in 2015, the Reddit blackout was initiated when the platform's Director of Communications, Victoria Taylor, was stood down from the company. And so during this blackout, Reddit's community moderators took more than 1,200 subreddits off the service in protest. Most mainstream media sources reported that Taylor's dismissal had caused the moderators to go dark. However, later reports actually revealed that even before Taylor's dismissal, Redditors had been voicing concerns around the platform's dependency on free labour and inadequate moderation tools. So while it's unclear what impact this actually had on Reddit, it did highlight how users try to influence digital platforms' governance decisions. So we see this in a lot of heated discussions on Reddit about incels, so the hateful and dangerous ideologies they espouse and the responses that Reddit should take. So pressure also comes from outside, and we've seen many examples of civil society organisations and the media pressuring platforms to do better. A clear example of this was in 2013, when the non-profit organisation Women, Action and the Media, in partnership with other signatories, wrote an open letter to Facebook about misogynistic groups that were hosted on the service. So Women, Action and the Media's campaigning led to more than 60,000 tweets and 5,000 emails to companies whose advertisements were shown alongside this abusive content. And as a result of this campaigning, Facebook actually replied to the open letter, and they took these groups that the organisations had identified off the service. So Reddit's support of incels too has been prominently criticised in the media, particularly around violent attacks like that in Toronto. So we know that effective self-regulation requires a lot of pressure. We know that change often comes as a response to sustained and/or external criticism. So in this project, we adapt an issue mapping methodology to understand how controversies around incels play out. So this included paying attention to discussions on the platform, contestation about the rules of incel subreddits and the terms of service, and also external pressure. So that's news reports about incels on Reddit are usually in response to external events and violent acts or threats. So to do this, we collected 13 million comments and 870,000 posts between 2011 and the end of August 2019. So using data that Nick has extracted from pushshift.io, we collected all available posts to incel subreddits and all posts that mention incel and all comments on relevant posts. We also collected all available articles in the mainstream media that actually mentioned incels, and this was from between 2015 to 2020, and that search gave us 2,033 articles from Factiva. So we filtered these posts to particularly focus on discussion of the rules, and we did this using topic modelling and keyword searches. We then read the comments and mainstream media articles to understand how pressure is exerted on Reddit and the moderators of incel subreddits. And this was also supplemented with quantitative analysis of upvotes and the comments posted. So to begin, we mapped the key incidents related to the incel community on Reddit and also more broadly on a timeline. So this timeline gave us a better understanding of the range of significant incidents that occurred on Reddit, such as changes to Reddit's rules and when incel communities were created or banned. We also mapped external events, such as physical violence and significant media publications. So to better understand what motivates Reddit to self-regulate its platform, we're looking at Reddit's moderation options. So we want to know what triggered Reddit's decision to first ban the major incel subreddit called incels, and then quarantine and then eventually ban brain cells. And we're investigating the impact of pressure from the internal community, so that's the users, and the external pressure from the government, the media, and civil society. So we can think of Reddit as having several layers of regulation that constrain users' behaviour. The first stage of this research is to understand what rules these communities actually create and enforce for themselves. So each subreddit has its own unique norms about acceptable behaviour, and users influence what is appropriate by collectively voting on and commenting on other people's posts and comments. Each subreddit also has more formal regulation imposed by its moderators. So Reddit has a different approach to content moderation than most digital platforms. And that's because it's user driven and it relies on its volunteer moderators to govern individual subreddits. So the moderators set and enforce these rules, and they also have the power to ban users and also remove content. So when the communities were active on Reddit, we could see that they consistently spoke about women in misogynistic ways. So their discussions show that the view that they feel entitled to romantic and sexual relationships. Paradoxically, however, this view is coupled with the degradation of women. So we're looking to understand how the rules of different subreddits evolved over time and what sort of content they decide is acceptable. So moving out from this, we can see how subreddits receive internal pressure from other Reddit users. So most users of other communities try to police what's going on in particular subreddits. And we see a lot of discussion about incels that happens in these other communities, like incel tears. So incel tears is a community that's dedicated to calling out incels' behaviour. And users from incel tears attempted to shift the discourse on incel subreddits, but were apparently often banned from these when they tried to do this. So we still need to do a lot more research to see how this actually played out, but it doesn't seem to have been particularly effective at changing the way that incels talk. So the next layer of regulation is Reddit's site-wide rules that apply to all communities that are hosted on the service. And the platform itself has the power to ban users and subreddits or to quarantine subreddits. And historically, though, Reddit has used this power relatively infrequently, although it has been under increasing pressure to clean up its subreddits. So Reddit's explicit bottom-up approach to regulation shows how they try to decentralize moderation to the moderators of the particular subreddits. And this can produce positive results by allowing communities to create rules that work for them. But it often fails when toxic subreddits have rules that don't align with what other people would expect of them. And so the final layer of self-regulation is external pressure from government, media, and civil society, which can be effective at enforcing the platform to change or enforce its rules and policies. So we can see from the data that there is very little correlation between media attention and Reddit self-regulation. So you can see here that there was almost no mainstream criticism in the lead up to the decision to ban incels, which was on November 7, 2017. There was a lot of coverage though about incels in April 2018 around the Toronto van attack, but at this stage Reddit actually did nothing. So the decision to quarantine brain cells was taken in September 2018, but there wasn't much in the press at this stage. There were a few petitions, but these weren't particularly significant. And these petitions were asking Reddit to take some type of action. And then on September 30, 2019, brain cells was banned. There was some coverage of incels on the 28th and the 29th of September, particularly relating to the Joker movie. But much of this discussion happens after Reddit actually banned this community. And in that same week, we also saw US law enforcement released a video of the Toronto van attacker who described his affiliation with the incel community. So we might be able to conclude that Reddit's decision wasn't really due to public pressure in the media. So what else was going on? So Reddit made the decision to ban incels in November 2017, which was before they became controversial in the press in early 2018. Our next step is to determine whether Reddit was under a lot of internal pressure. And although we can't identify any causal factors with this, we want to explore what was going on at this time. In 2017, there were a lot of discussions around the tech community, primarily about what responsibility tech companies should have. And in mid-2017, Charlottesville's Unite the Right rally also prompted a period of reflection in Silicon Valley. And many social media platforms, including Reddit, updated their rules on speech after this incident. It was then presumably only a matter of time before brain cells showed how it violated these new rules. Okay, so as I've said, this is a work in progress. So what we're going to do next is investigate how controversies about rules play out on Reddit itself. We want to know how posters to incel subreddits talk about what is acceptable, how are the social norms contested, and how does this influence the rules that moderators enforce. We also want to know how the discussion outside of incel subreddits plays out, how the users are trying to pressure either Reddit, other users, or moderators of incel subs to change rules and norms. And finally, we want to see if we can identify a set of factors that lead to various decisions to quarantine or ban incel subreddits. So significantly, this research shows us the challenges of large social media platforms and the communities they contain in regulating themselves. Reddit's moderation system shows that it would prefer a world where all of its moderators do the work. Reddit wants to devolve responsibility to group admins, but this project shows us how difficult that really is. That works well when groups are well functioning and creating rules that work for them, but don't interfere with other people. And when the moderators condone harmful content and behavior, the result is a subreddit that's comprised of users and rules that people who aren't in those communities consider to be harmful. And it shows us that Reddit isn't really doing well to enforce its rules on scale. It relies so much on its volunteer moderators that only the rules of each particular subreddit matter, and that isn't only until the subreddits get banned. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Clap reaction. There we go. Thank you. Okay, and finally, Lelia, can I say first of all what a delight it is to see you, and it's a shame you're not here on the sunny East Coast today.
It is, but it was ever thus.
Yeah,
certainly for the last few weeks.
Yeah. We're talking about about doing a post-conference before you have the conference, and it's a bit like when we used to talk about postmodernism and what it meant in relation to modernism. You know, when did we leave modernism and go into postmodernism? Yes, anyway, yes. Enough of that, and over to you.
Right. Well, this is my first lecture via Zoom, so I'm just hoping to share the screen and get it to work properly. And so fingers crossed. And so now to go into the slideshow. Great. And obviously I've started halfway through, so I'll go back to where I was. Going wrong way. Maybe we could start again. Okay, here I am, the opening slide. So I was looking at the issue of big tech, corporate social responsibility, and democratic ideals. And the reason why I'm looking at corporate social responsibility is because this is an area of growing importance, nationally and internationally, where consumers are increasingly calling big organizations and companies to account. And the question is, how would this work with the huge technology companies? So we've heard a little bit about Cambridge Analytica from Stuart, but what's interesting is that although the stock market at that point did recover after the hearing in the US government, when the scandal first broke, Facebook's share price fell by 8.5%, which was equivalent to 45 billion. Now, everybody who holds shares in Facebook would have had a small shiver of anticipation that, you know, what can be in favor can equally drop out of favor very quickly. And this is one way in which, in theory, capitalism is supposed to work. It's supposed to be able to call corporate entities to account. And we heard a little bit about how Reddit is being called to account by activists who are objecting to some of the content, and some very successful consumer boycotts, both within and outside Reddit, expressing a concern. And what is becoming clearer is that more and more companies have to sign up to a version of corporate social responsibility because it impacts upon profitability and upon share price. And if they get it wrong, it's increasingly likely to lead to legislation and regulation. And I would argue that the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation is the most robust attempt at date to call the big tech companies to some kind of account. Whereas at the same time, corporate social responsibility is seen as building brand sustainability. And many of these big tech companies originally had their roots in a very liberal democratic way of looking at corporate social responsibility. So for example, the old Google adage, do no evil, which they tended to drop some years later when it was clear that actually evil was quite profitable in many ways. So Cambridge Analytica, and I think it's worth just remembering that that became public as a result of the established legacy media, and through the old-fashioned way of whistleblowers. And whistleblowers are the key means through which a lot of the information about how corporate tech should be brought to account is getting out these days. So in this case, Wiley was the whistleblower, and he explained how psychographic profiling was identifying hot button topics that could then be sell audiences with hot button vulnerability to unknown players at that point who were on the dark web buying fake news circulation effectively, with both the US election and Brexit likely to have been influenced by those practices. And Wiley, the whistleblower, argues that we need to understand that protection of democracy, including understanding how capitalism works, is a national security issue. When any country interferes with your democracy, they are attacking you. And it was in a discussion at one point that I began to realize that 2019 threw up two particular compelling arguments for different conceptions of what it is for big tech to take accountability of their actions and their platforms effectively. And the two opposite viewpoints both have a very strong standing in liberal democratic nations. So the first was Jacinda Ardern, removing content in pursuit of being responsible. And the second was Julian Assange, posting content in pursuit of the right to know. So I'm going to follow those particular threads a little bit further. So Jacinda Ardern, just to remind everybody, came to global prominence after the Christchurch mosque terrorist shootings in March 2019. And although the original footage was viewed about 4,000 times, and Facebook removed that, they then had to spend time removing 1.5 million copies of it in the next 24 hours, which goes to show how much that sort of content is shared and discussed and circulated amongst key publics. And in contrast to the Reddit thread that we were hearing about, and the discussion about incels, the politics, Ardern was very careful not to use or give credence to the shooters' politics, not to name them, and to focus instead on victims and support stricken communities. The Christchurch call, almost a year ago today in Paris, which combined New Zealand's PM with a leader in the European space, Emmanuel Macron, called to the end of the circulation of abhorrent material. And at that point, it was good corporate social responsibility for 5 of the big tech companies to vow to aggressively monitor their services for material that encourages and facilitates violence. Now, the EU and 17 other signatories argued for better regulation and an end to this free circulation, whereas the US declined to support this action, relying upon their First Amendment that the best tool to defeat terrorist speech is productive speech. However, that would have meant that the Christchurch shootings material would have stayed on the web much longer. So there is an argument that some existing legislation could be used to call different organisations to account. So, for example, where does news stop and snuff movies start, and the illegality of that? What about protections against incitement to racial hatred and vilification? And what if we were, as the UK argued last year, to start treating the platforms like publishers, answerable and responsible for the content they carry? So Coyle, the co-author of that UK review, said they'd have to do a lot of work to comply with that perception of their role. But arguably, that is a large element of what they're doing. So Scott Morrison, and clearly with a population of 25 million, the Australian view on this is much less compelling to big tech than the 446 million citizens in the EU. But Scott Morrison in Australia argued that big social media companies have a responsibility to take every possible action to ensure their technology products are not exploited, and says that it shouldn't be self-regulation, it should be the law. And that was really reinforced by the former MD of Facebook Australia, who then said, unless there are negative consequences, then you don't take things seriously. Negative consequences drive behaviour and focus the mind. Which, oh, dear, which is the impact of, having fun here, this is old tech, which is brings us to the issue of the General Data Protection Regulation in the EU, because they are, because that is, as I said, again, a year ago it came into effect, covers the whole of the EU, and it attempts to reinforce what they see as human rights for the digital age, particularly looking at personal data. And then they argued that previously we have regulations that everyone assumed they could get away with breaking, but now people have to assume that they may not get away with it. So the penalties that have been exercised famously against Google are still going through appeal. So it's hard to know how much will stick and when it will stick. But given that the potential penalties are 20 million euros or 4% of global turnover, whichever is the bigger, they are huge. And even Google's shareholders would have to start taking some notice of those. So looking at the alternative face of what it is to have media operating in favour of and platforms of a liberal democracy, Julian Assange, who's arguably his high point in his life would have been the 2010 revelations around an unprovoked US Apache helicopter gunship attack on Iraqi civilians. So the revelations were in 2010, the footage dated from 2007. Now he's currently in the UK facing a 175-year potential prison sentence in the US for hacking and espionage. And there's a global petition with currently heading up towards half a million signatures seeking to identify his actions as not espionage, but as journalism. So just to remind you, when we're talking about snuff movies, when we're talking about the acceptability or otherwise of massacres, this video, leaked in April 2010, showed an Apache helicopter taking 12 people in Baghdad, including 2 Reuters staff. And essentially the two pilots talking as though it was a video game. Look at that, right through the windshield, ha ha. And journalists have tended to rally to Julian Assange, not because of his character reference, but because of what he was aiming to do there in terms of how it allowed a calling to account. The footage of arguably distressing and very confronting material nonetheless meant that the helicopters could be identified as not responding to an active firefight, not having done due diligence to check that the victims were insurgents, and that it was in the public interest that the world should have seen the raw footage of what happened. The argument is it wasn't revelation espionage, but journalism. So we have here a set of conflicted standards, effectively, with one person arguing for the call of removal of confronting footage, and the other sort of arguing for its circulation and use as part of public debate. And indeed, the West has track record here. For many years, they did not suppress ISIS-Daesh footage of executions because they saw that it hardened public opinion against that kind of terrorism. And, you know, even in Australia, we've had the image of a 17-year-old holding the severed head of a Syrian soldier. So the challenge in this corporate social responsibility debate is to seek future-facing possibilities that embody the ideals of open society, civic responsibility, market autonomy, because we're living in a capitalist society, and accountability under law, whilst at the same time supporting new forms of corporate social responsibility that enable an enhanced vision for digital citizenship and benefits the societies and the individuals in which they live. And as has been identified previously, there is a lot of coalescence around addressing child exploitation content online. So there are areas of common agreement that can be built on, but there is less consensus on issues such as what is hate speech and misinformation, and what are tolerable forms of public debate, even if they are offensive and polarizing. So I just jump to the end and say that this paper was originally based on a conversation with Tom O'Regan of University of Queensland, and he invited me to give a seminar just under a year ago there that has formed the basis of this. So thank you very much, and that's the end of my presentation.
Terry, you're on mute.
Sorry, unmuted. I don't know if you saw that "Let It Be" parody as they're saying, John, you're in mute. Yeah. So I was saying, I think, Lelia, your presentation provides us, I think, with some very good starting points for a conversation. And the one I identified, you know, distilling it three sets of issues. One around the competing conceptions of accountability and the questions of openness and open speech on the one hand, and the questions of regulation, control, sanction on the other. The second was that around action and the relative balance between looking to governments to act and the risks associated with that, as distinct from activist or consumer or whistleblower type action. And the third being from the quote that you had there, which I hadn't come across, that, you know, in the absence, but it's obvious in a sense, in the absence of negative consequences, things won't get done. And I was thinking there about another debate that's been happening in parallel to this that we haven't really focused on in the session, but about regulators themselves. And certainly in the wake of the global financial crisis, and in Australia, the Hayne Royal Commission into the banking sector and so on, the sense that soft law, co-regulation, self-regulation had become, if you like, too soft. And I think, you know, following the ACCC inquiry, someone like Rod Sims being very much almost an activist around his area and giving this commission, which I tend to associate with things like electricity prices or, you know, the cost of parking a plane at the airport or whatever, this very high public profile. So I wonder, could I throw it open to whoever wants to pick up on those issues to comment?
Stuart, sorry, Terry, yes, I think that you're right. This issue of community standards, which was very much foregrounded by the Hay and Well Commission in Australia, which identifies, you know, what I suppose 100 years ago might have been called the man on the Clapham omnibus, the idea that there's a sense in the public imaginary about what is and what isn't appropriate behaviour in which circumstances. And I suppose the question that arises is, could an algorithm work like that? And even if it could, should it? It's a bit like the Minority Report, you know, creating a guilty verdict before something happens. We have to acknowledge that most of the big tech organizations do have active moderators that get involved when the algorithms show up something with particular complexity. But it's really important, I think, that this idea of community standards, which can be different in different countries, obviously, needs to be taken into account in terms of the ways in which both regulators and the big platforms and content circulators behave, because it's that balance that people need to get, and also discussions around the complex cases.
Lelia, I just let me put a question to you that's related to this. But don't you think that don't you think we've gone beyond corporate social responsibility as a guarantor of corporate behaviour, a good behaviour now? I mean, the extent to which governments and I suppose lots of advocates, but certainly governments have been prepared to go in, and you've quoted some of them, the extent of the fines that have been meted out in the European Union for a variety of infractions by Google and Facebook, the 190 million, I think, or 170 million US fine on YouTube for breaking COPPA, the Protection of Children Act. I mean, these are whopping fines, and they're basically signals from a variety of governments, not only the classic distinction between, you know, the laissez-faire First Amendment US versus the heavy regulatory environment in the EU. These very, very large fines for significant infractions would suggest that governments of various sorts have really gone beyond the idea that CSR, corporate social responsibility, could act as an effective deterrent for bad action in this environment. I mean, I just thought that your theme of corporate social responsibility, of course, very important, but is it anywhere near sufficient in the current regulatory environment?
Sorry, Lelia, you're muted for a minute there.
Okay, sorry. I don't see the two as an either or, because corporate social responsibility is partly the corporate organizations responding to regulators as well. So we saw that with the Christchurch call, you know, when the 5 big tech companies all said, oh yes, we're going to, you know, aggressively monitor violent content. The thing is that being aware of regulators and responding to big fines and concerns is an important part of driving good corporate behavior. But the question about the money is only part of the story. The US is absolutely legendary in its willingness or unwillingness really to get involved. So for example, you know, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were both suggesting dismantling large many of these large organizations. And the regulators have essentially turned a blind eye to the fact that they have monopoly markets. So arguably, sort of Facebook's acquisition of Instagram meant that it was really buying up the competition. So the markets aren't working properly, but they're not doing anything to regulate that either. So I think corporate social responsibility works hand in hand with regulators, that they become more responsible the more they realize the costs and the impacts of not being responsible.
I just wanted to add a couple of observations on the US context there. And I was thinking also the Federal Trade Commission's $5 billion fine against Facebook. And the US is a very complicated beast that the FCC has basically ruled itself out of the equation, and antitrust law is very difficult to apply in this context. And there's really interesting debate about competition and monopoly there. But something like the FTC is very activist, and it's the state of California that is proposing privacy laws, which, as happened with motor vehicles, become a kind of de facto national standard by virtue of the sheer size of the Californian market. Now, Rosalie, Reddit, I think it was very interesting the extent to which Reddit taking action on things is, for the most part, not driven by things that happened on the Reddit platform, but driven by external events. Do you want to comment on that? And I think also, is the moderation model that Reddit has sustainable into the future? I think, one of the legacies of COVID-19 is going to be that big platform, like they are the shares that are booming on the market at the moment, the tech platforms, but this brings them into, a much bigger part of the public space. Will it still be possible to have a small corner of the world that is Reddit that stays out of the remit of, government?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. I think it's really interesting how at this time we are seeing that this techlash against digital platforms really seems to have subsided. And I mean, I know I've spoken to you about this looking on Facebook. It seems like everybody is so positive about Facebook's role in allowing people to communicate with their relatives overseas. So I'm not entirely sure if the same thing is happening on Reddit. That's something that I should actually look at though, because Reddit is a news site as well, and they allow people to communicate with each other, interact in those communities. So it might be the case that people are feeling the same way about Reddit. I'm not entirely sure. But at the same time, we know that groups like the alt-right really, they became mainstream once they went on Reddit. So they had originally been on some of the white supremacist websites, or 4chan and 8chan, and they then made their way over to Reddit, and that really did make this community mainstream. So I don't know if they can continue in their current unregulated state, because we're seeing real harm from this. Thousands of people all around the world have the ability to see and communicate with other people who have these harmful views. So, and anybody can go and look at that. You don't need an account. Anybody can look on the service. So, I don't know. Obviously, obviously Reddit prides itself on its freedom of expression. So, I think that's something that I should really look out for, actually, when I'm doing this research, and see if there has been a change around this time. And sorry, what was your first question again?
Oh, no, that'll do. I was just thinking a small platform's one with 340 million users on it. So it's all relative.
If I can ask you a question, Rosalie, there might be it might be interesting to ask yourself, how big is Reddit as a company? By virtue of number of employees, revenue, turnover, the amount of content on it. I mean, we have legendary figures about, so many years of content uploaded every minute to YouTube, blah, blah, blah. What's the scale of Reddit? And is there any correlation between this small, so-called small platform and the fact that they rely so much on their moderation at the level of the subreddit, which obviously is going to get them into lots of problems, but compared to Facebook and YouTube, which have been just forced, whether they like it or not, to be doing enormous amounts of manual, hiring thousands and thousands and thousands of moderators. I mean, that's one of the key reasons why it's just unlikely to be sustainable in the long term. But is there a relationship between the political economy fundamentals of Reddit and the delegation strategy for moderation?
Yeah, and I'm not actually too sure how many people are actually working at Reddit. As you mentioned, Facebook has hired, I think, around 15,000 content moderators. On Reddit, most of that responsibility is placed on their users. And I don't actually know if Reddit does any content moderation themselves, except for when a user makes a report to the service. I'm assuming that then somebody from the platform must go in. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure. That's something that I should also look at.
Stuart, I wonder if I could throw a question. Oh, sorry, Lelia, were you going to say something on that? Oh.
Yes, I was. I was going to come back a little bit to the discussion of the incel groups, because the emerging model around best practice of handling terrorists, but particularly random mass killings, is not to use the politics and not to name the perpetrator, because that is seen as being, as it were, the ego boost that person wanted to achieve, and it fuels possible future copycat type behavior. Has there been any discussion on Reddit around those sorts of issues and, as it were, a different kind of responsibility to victims rather than to users, in terms of not fueling the fire that drives these extraordinarily hateful behaviors?
Yeah, so we have seen some of that discussion in some of these communities, particularly on incel tiers, which I mentioned in my presentation. That's the community that was created to call out incel behaviour. And on that service, they definitely do talk about these perpetrators and how they think. I've seen some posts on users saying that they should be removed because, I mean, for instance, lots of the users in the incel community, their pictures, for instance, after an attack, they would often change their display photo to these people who had perpetrated these horrific acts. And we see that now. There's actually a new website now that the incels have created since they've been booted off every platform. And they still do this. They keep putting up their pictures. So I think like there is the potential for this behavior to have real world physical harm consequences. And Reddit users are really concerned about this. But in the incel communities themselves, they do treat these people like they're heroes. For instance, with the first incel that I know of who killed killed maybe 7 people, and he is now referred to as their supreme leader. And since then, in 2014, we have seen many acts of physical violence. So the extent to which that actually, encourages people to commit these acts, it's something that people should really be questioning.
Thank you. I want to throw a question to Stuart, and given time, it'll be the final question. And I'm thinking here, your paper referred to Canada and Australia as competing cases. Being more familiar with the Australian context, I'm aware that we've had a lot of conversation in Australia about the future of news and the future of journalism, and the figures and trends have been fairly alarming. less so around the future of broadcasting and the future of entertainment, but I guess that you know, a lot of alarm bells have been starting to ring about the future of the free-to-air networks in particular, and we can see how some of this is playing out around issues such as sports, the future of sports rights in the absence of sport, but obviously the Australian content rules, children's standards rules, and so on. Do you want to comment on your thoughts about the Canadian approach, which is proposing this kind of aggregated model, if you like, where everything from YouTube to Netflix to conventional broadcasters starts to come under the same standards, and the debate in Australia, which until very recently has typically seen these as quite different models?
Yeah, yes. I mean, you know, we are getting to a stage where something that's been in place since the 1960s, which is the Australian content standards for commercial television and radio, are now under, I think, very direct threat. I mean, Channel 7 has indicated that they do not intend to keep within the regulations on children's television, and they have indicated formally that they are moving towards not meeting the requirements for adult in the adult sphere, that is in the prime time regulations. So we've had the broadcasters crying foul, if you like, about these for a long time. I mean, for decades. But it's really only now that they are beginning to say, or certainly 7 is prepared to say, we are going to enter into non-compliance. Now, this puts an enormous amount of pressure on government because, as you know, Terry, the quid pro quo principle that all this is based on. We're going to protect you from competition. We're going to do everything in our power to continue to allow you to be a profitable enterprise. And there are many ways in which they have done this materially in the last decade or so and longer, as long as you deliver on these cultural and social objectives. And that settlement is very much breaking down. So the contrast between Canada and Australia, I mean, remembering that I'm talking about sets of documents that have not been enacted into law or into regulation, they are all indicative of where we might be going. But if we take them as that, the Canadian root and branch review is one that is doubling down in a European kind of way on the need for consistent more consistent regulatory treatment of particularly the foreign streamers, and of course the platforms. Whereas in Australia, we've got I think very much bifurcated approaches. On the one hand, we've got government being prepared to say, for the first time, a mandated terms of trade to save journalism, essentially. And on the other, we've got what I think is more likely to come out of this than not on the cultural side, and that is further deregulation, probably stepped deregulation, but stepped deregulation of the Australian content standards, plus further incentives to bring the streamers into play as commissioners. I just don't see the chances of a Canadian style approach I just don't think it's remotely likely in Australia. So, I mean, you know, government's taking the news question very seriously, but I don't think that we're going to get very much regulatory action. We're going to get, I mean, remembering, I mean, the thing I didn't say in the paper, of course, is that the interests of the local interests are diametrically opposed, of course. News media wants more regulation. They are of one voice on that, whereas the same entities often saying we want deregulation in the cultural space, and the reality is that they are going to be highly influential.
Okay, I think at that point we'll conclude the formal discussion. I mean, the thing about doing these things on Zoom is we could all gather at the same time tomorrow and have conversations about all the issues that we've raised here. But I think it's time to say thanks very much to everyone for being a part of this. And I think I can turn off the recording from here.
And thanks to you, Terry, for putting it together, and Rosalie as well.
Thanks a lot. Yes, very interesting. Great fun.
And now, before